Four-cylinder engine, even with fuel injection, could not match the big English and Italian models. The Maserati V6 engine was the perfect powerhouse for this new, imposing coupe. And the SM had the same sports success as the DS. Her first appearance in the 1971 Moroccan Rally ended in victory, despite extreme conditions. And the coach builders were also very interested. Henri Chaperon again waved his magic wand, transforming the coupe into this majestic open-top limousine. The estate car, ordered by the French government, made its triumphal debut for the Queen of England's visit to Paris the 15th of May 1972, and others were to follow. This is an SM Opera. Its particularity is that Citroën didn't build it. They only built the SM Coupe. The basic model was transformed by Henri Chaperon, who lengthened the body and made it a four-door model. The story goes that in 1972, President Pompidou ordered an open-top SM as a state car. Citroën asked Chaperon to study the feasibility of this conversion, which he did, and afterwards Chaperon recovered the costs of this study by selling, under his own name, a few examples of this limousine. He increased the length by 29 centimetres to fit in the rear passengers. I use it occasionally, but in summer I prefer to drive my convertible Chaperon DS. It's another very, very special car. 6 months after the SM appeared came the GS, which at last was a proper mid-range car between the 2CV and the DS. Its computer-aided design had a definitely modern look, which was just as well because, like the traction before it, the GS was a make-or-break car for Citroën. Once again, the company's tradition of perpetual technological advance had left it broke. So the GS had a lot on its shoulders, and one could say that innovations like its greedy bi-rotor rotary engine were a strategic mistake. In 1973, the world was smack in the middle of the oil crisis, and the image of a Citroën helicopter with the same engine was not going to change things. In 1974, history repeated itself. Citroën had again overstretched itself. The company was put under control of the old enemy Peugeot. Citroën had entered the lion's den, and it seemed impossible it could survive. The first example, in 1976, the mythical factory at Javel was closed. A piece of automobile history fell into ruins. Citroën became a brand name of Peugeot. The social company initially just used its former rival's mechanical parts, and the LNA was a perfect example. A 2CV engine in a Peugeot 104 coupe body. As for the Visa, there's nothing we can say about its bodywork, destined to sit on top a 104 chassis. Even the GS, which had started to show promise, was replaced by the plastic-loving GSA. Only the futuristic dashboard gave any hint that it had once been a Citroën, and this was probably just a ruse to take attention away from its meagre mechanical improvements. The early 80s saw Citroën enter the era of cheap plastic and terrible finishing. What a waste. But let's go back now to 1974. The new factory at Aulnay came into operation, and a new system of work organisation for Citroën. One positive aspect of Peugeot's reign. I was there at the opening of the Aulnay site back in 1973-1974. It was the birth of a new factory and a new car, the CX. The Aulnay factory was much more automated than the Javel factory, and a lot of research had gone into improving the conditions of work of the workforce. As for the organisation of the work, the division of labour was still based on the Taylor method. This meant that each workstation had a well-defined task and a fixed time to do it in. But there were certain improvements which meant that the work was less physically demanding. There was no manhandling of material, since everything was automated. Another example were the workers who were working on mechanical parts, such as the engine or the gearbox, no longer had to physically follow the part. They were transported on a kind of rolling conveyor belt. Another important difference between Javel and Aulnay was that at Javel, the hierarchy was long and very rigid. There were workshop managers, the foremen, the team leaders, section leaders, and finally the worker who actually built the car. Aulnay introduced the Mercure plan. In organisational terms, the hierarchic levels in the workshop between the boss and the worker were reduced by 50%. As I had said before, there were so many levels of hierarchy beforehand, and the plan really cut out the bureaucracy. Under the new plan, the director now had sector managers. The sector manager had two supervisory levels below him, one who was about the level of the former workshop manager, and the other who was the equivalent of the former team leader. But the biggest move forward was that everyone's job was more fulfilling. And whereas before the old team leader had no one he could turn to if he had a problem, now he could ask the new production assistants to help him carry out his particular task. Coming out in October 1974, the CX was a Peugeot-era car, but had its roots in the Michelin years, and like its predecessors, it inspired the coach builders. This is rather a special car, because it's the only hand-built cabriolet that was allowed to run on the road. It was presented at the 1984 Paris Car Show, and at Geneva just before that. Only 4 were built by a little French provincial coach builder. It's a CX Berlin GTI. The client could choose his base vehicle, and I wanted a GTI. And I chose mother of pearl for the car, and red for the leather seats because they're official Citroën colours. It's a symbol of its era, which is why I chose it. All the accessories on the engine are genuine Citroën parts. Here you can see the double front headlights by Moët. The rectangular rear lights are the same as the Visa, and the dashboard is a Giga, straight from the Citroën catalogue of the time. I've had the car since 1984. It was this car that was on show at Paris. I've done 50,000 kilometres in it and attended all the major Citroën shows. The mechanics are those of a series Berlin. It's had no modifications at all. The CX is the last of Citroën's cars to be accepted into the closed world of the collector, a further proof of its legitimacy, which is a good reason for looking more closely at Citroën collectors. Citroën is the most collected make of car in Europe after the Americans. Even compared to the more prestigious makes, it still attracts more collectors. And our shows are always very well attended. Of the 200 Citroën clubs in France, about 140 are federated to l'Amicale Citroën. There are about 6,500 collectors affiliated. There isn't really a typical Citroën collector. It depends on the model. There are 2CV collectors who, if you like, are celebrating a certain lifestyle. Then there are those who collect the DS, or the SM, or the Traction, who are all different. But there are some who collect every model, The most popular collector's item is the 2CV, followed by the DS and the Traction. Since 2001, the only site is the home of the Citroën Conservatory, created by Pierre Peugeot. This treasure chest honours the past of the company's name, and although this Alibaba's cave is not open to the public, it's not just a vulgar storeroom. Just the opposite.
The
Citroën Conservatory has two main functions. The first is to gather together a collection that represents the history of the make. And this collection consists of vehicles, documents, and various other artifacts. And it's our responsibility to look after and preserve this collection. And we pay for this through our second function. We provide vehicles, documents, and other objects to various events that we either organise ourselves or organised by external bodies such as museums. In our vehicle collection, we have about 350 pieces at our disposal. And not just production cars. We also have concept cars and prototypes that were used to develop production cars. And we also have certain models that we want to restore. The jewel of our document collection is a history of Citroën car production since the very first model built back in 1919, the Type A0001. And it's interesting to note that production records between 1919 and 1979 were handwritten documents that we now have here today. We also have extensive documentation concerning repair and maintenance, publicity tracks, the exchange of spare parts, and various posters. We've put together this collection in the same way that anyone goes about building up a family treasure, using various methods. The nicest way is for people to make donations. They hear about the existence of the Citroën Heritage Conservatory. They say to us, we have an object that we don't want to be thrown away. Do you want it? This happened with various objects for the China expedition. The family of one of the mechanics on the expedition approached us and said, there are certain objects from that trip that our father has kept in his attic. He's just died, do you want them? It's a way of building up a collection which I find very touching. This is true for both objects and for cars. The other way, of course, is for us to buy things. Let's say we have a network of investigators, either members of collectors' clubs or people in the car trade who know what we are looking for, who tell us about the existence of certain rare pieces and who offer to sell them to us. One of our latest purchases is this Type A Grand Lux Tourer, built in the 1920s. Only 300 were ever built, so it's very, very rare. And we traced it to a barn just outside Poitiers. This part of the collection consists of the vehicles that we hire out to external organisations. This workshop is essentially a storage room that the public do not have access to. But we don't want this collection to just rot away. It has to play its part in promoting the history of Citroën to the outside world. Since the arrival in 1997 of Jean-Martin Foltz at the head of the PSA group, Citroën seems to have finally woken up and taken its head out of the lion's mouth. The concept car lineage of the C6, the C3 and Pluriel concept, now the C3 Pluriel, seem to herald the return of audacity for the twin chevron, an audacity which knows how to draw on previous success. Citroën President Claude Satinet. When a company has had such a glorious past as Citroën, you have always to ask yourself how this past can be used to construct the future. Let's start by saying what you must not do. You must not build a modern car which is a replica of an older model. And it won't work because we all have a different image of a classic car, and it's impossible to allow for all these memories when building a modern car. On the other hand, you can reuse the same values that you found on cars of the past. As an example, it would be a very bad idea to build a new 2CV. However, on the new C3, you can find elements of the 2CV, a spacious interior and a simple exterior. This, to me, seems the right way to go. You have to use the past to prepare the future, and you should always be proud of what you have achieved. And with such a glorious past, who could doubt the renewal of a glorious future? Safe route.